My name is Chris Conte. I'm a journalist and consultant for ICFJ. The issue we'll be discussing today is one that is very dear to many Africans: education. We'll discuss the big issues facing Africa in education, and we'll also look at ways that journalists should think about and cover them. We'll also explore what research is showing about what approaches to improving educational outcomes work best. The presentation you'll hear is designed to support quality journalism. So we'll finally be offering some tips for reporting on education and give you some resources you can use to make sure that you are well informed about education issues. Our guest today is David Evans. He is a senior economist at the World Bank and is currently a member of actually the senior economist for a team at the World Bank that is producing a World Development Report that will focus on education. The World Development Report is one of the bank's most important annual publications, and it represents a huge amount of work. This one will not be out until late next year, which gives you an idea just how much work our guest is doing in the whole subject. Dave has worked evaluating programs, many programs in Africa, in agriculture, health and social protection, as well as education, in the Gambia, Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Tanzania. Some of you may remember Dave as the honored guest of the first webinar in this series when he introduced us to the whole discipline of evaluating the impact of development projects. As with all of the webinars in this series, this session is meant to be highly interactive. So please look on your screen. There's a Q&A button. Push it frequently and send us your questions. My job is to be relaying those questions to Dave, and my goal is, with your help, to keep him very, very busy for the next hour or so. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dave Evans.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. It's a great opportunity to be here. Now, just to add a little bit to Chris's introduction, I want to give a perspective on reporting on education from the perspective of someone who works actively in education. Obviously, as journalists, you're already reporting on education, and there are a lot of things that you know about the best way to do that I don't know. So I just want to give a few perspectives about how we might continue to report in the best possible form from the perspective of people working in education and doing research in education. So obviously, education is absolutely essential when we think about international development in any country. So hundreds of millions of dollars of budget go into it. All of our children go through it. The next generation of leaders pass through the education system. So there really isn't much more important than that. So what we'll talk about today are, first, what are the big issues in education in Africa? How should we even think about education? How should we think about education programs, so the kinds of programs that people use to try to improve education or get children into school? What actually works to improve educational outcomes? What do we know about that? And then a few tips and a few resources. So first, a few big issues. So one of the principal issues, and what I would argue is the fundamental lens through which it makes sense to look at education in Africa, is the lens of access and quality. So in the last 40 years, Africa has made major strides in educational access. So if you look at this chart, what it shows is since 1975, what percentage of primary school children are out of school? And you can see that back in 1975, more than half of primary school children were out of school, if you follow that orange line. But that number has dropped dramatically. So as of just about 4 or 5 years ago, that number was down to 20%. Now that still means that 1 in 5 children who are primary school age aren't in school. And that number is especially high in the most vulnerable countries where there's conflict and challenges like that. even with secondary school, where the data is more recent. So the World Bank started tracking the secondary school data just about 15, 16 years ago. And you can see from the blue line that as of about 2000, just under half of secondary school age students were not in secondary school. And we can see that that number is still very high. About 1/3 of children who should be in lower secondary school aren't there. So the first principal axis that we think about education on is access. Are children getting to school? Do they have the opportunity to get an education? But at the same time, as we think about access, it's absolutely crucial to balance that with a look at quality. So quality education is a major struggle. If you look at the international tests, so for example, there's one common international test is the TIMSS. It's an international test of mathematics. Only one African country has participated in the most recent round of TIMSS. It tests 4th grade students. So what you can see here is we've got a list of countries that participated in the TIMSS, and we've got Botswana, the one country in Africa that did participate in the round. And as you can see, it's actually at the bottom of the list. And this isn't comparing this isn't comparing Botswana to Singapore or Finland, some of these real global leaders in education. This is comparing Botswana to other middle-income countries like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and Thailand. Now, other African countries haven't participated in the TIMSS, but they have participated in some other tests. So for example, most of the Anglophone countries in sub-Saharan Africa have participated in another test of math called the SACMEC. And in that one, we see Botswana did relatively well. It wasn't the top scorer across all the African countries, but it did pretty well. And there are a lot of countries that did significantly worse, that are below Botswana in that list. And so we know, since Botswana participated in both tests, that a lot of these African nations are really struggling to deliver quality education. So even while there have been these great advances in access, many, many children are still failing to learn what we hope they'll learn from an education system. Now, of course, an education system does more than just teach children reading and math. It can teach citizenship. It can help children learn important social skills. All of these can benefit children later on in life. But we also feel like education should fundamentally be giving children the building blocks for a lifetime of education. And that starts with reading and writing and mathematics. And there's still a real struggle for that. So I would propose that as we think about educational issues in Africa, we use access. Do children have the opportunity to get into the education system? And quality. Do children actually learn once they get there as our principal lens? So these issues come up in the news. So I surveyed a few just recent news pieces on education in Africa. A recent piece on Liberia. Liberia's education sector still low compared to international standards. On this piece from Front Page Africa Online. Another piece on Malawi's school certificate of education examination results. So as I searched through a sample of recent articles on education in Africa, the quality of education, how well children were doing in school, came up again and again. So this is a really high priority issue. So remember, when we think about any new program or policy or intervention, we should think about how is it affecting access? Is it getting children into school? And is it affecting quality? So for example, when we think about a program that provides school meals for children, for example, a free breakfast or a free lunch at school. So those kinds of programs might be particularly helpful at helping with access because, you know, children, especially in poor households, may not have access to 3 meals a day at home. And so offering free meals can really get a lot of children to school. It's less obvious exactly how that's going to work on quality. It might work. Children who are hungry, obviously, might not be able to spend as much attention focusing on the class. And so it might also matter in that regard. But when we report on programs and interventions and policies, we have to think about this double lens, access and quality. So another issue that's come up very frequently in the news related to African education is the private versus the public sector. So relatively few primary school students, about 1 in 10 across Africa, are in private schools. But that masks a huge variation. So you go from countries like Malawi and Mozambique, where almost no students in primary school are in private schools, to countries like Madagascar and Togo, where as many as 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 students are in private schools. When we get to secondary school, the proportion is much higher, about 20% across the continent and as high as 40% in Madagascar. Now, this is a big issue in terms of policy. So last year in Liberia, there were some steps to dramatically expand private provision of schooling to turn a lot of the education of primary school students over to private schools. That met with a lot of controversy, and there have been some steps back and forth in that regard. And we see this again reflected in the news. A recent piece in the Morning Star Online in the UK highlighted how in Uganda teachers were excited about this judicial ruling against what's called tin shack school profiteers, which is a derogatory term for private schools. I think it's an unfair term, certainly for all private schools, but that's the way this was characterized in this piece. Likewise, in Kenya, in an article just a couple of days ago, Kenya teachers take after Uganda and argue for the ban of UK-backed private schools. So this is a very hot-button issue. And when we report and think about private schools versus public schools, again, we want to think through this double lens. What are private school expansions likely to do for access? So will they help children who haven't had access to school get into school? And what are they likely to do about quality? Will they help children get a better education? Will they not? So those are two issues that come up a lot. But as I review news pieces on education in Africa, we actually see many other issues. There's a lot of coverage of teachers. So for example, here are 2 pieces from Kenya, one on a legislative proposal to raise the standards by which teachers are allowed to enter into the teaching profession. And so say, well, look, you really have to have higher grades than you've had in the past to get into the teaching profession. Exams also take a lot of coverage. And so, for example, again in Kenya, a record number of students taking the secondary school final examination this year. So these are, I've highlighted 2 examples from Kenya, but I've seen them over and over again in the news from across Africa. Now, while we think of all of these things through the lens of access and quality, at the same time, it's important to think about who are the different players and factors in education. So every education policy affects at least one of these factors or players. So I've put up here a very simple model of how education works. So what we want is for children to learn. We want them to learn to read and write, and we want them to learn other things. So the number one factor to that, of course, is the children and their parents and the support they give and their preparation and effort. That's why that's up there at the top. Now, over on the side, we see that teachers are also extremely important. We have research from around the world that the teachers are the single most important factor in school for producing student learning. That probably doesn't come as a surprise. At the same time, there are some other factors. School governance, so the leadership of the school director, how the community is involved in the school. And then also the inputs. And so many of us who've visited schools, we've seen schools where, you know, there's no roof on the school, so if it rains, classes have to be canceled, or where no students have access to textbooks or information like that. And you can imagine that learning is much more difficult when that takes place. So this is a very simple model, and the reason I bring this up is because when we think about a policy that's supposed to affect teachers, so let's say a government introduces a new program to provide incentives for teachers, financial incentives if their students go well. It's important to think not only how that affects teachers and their preparation and effort, but also going back to these other factors. Can giving incentives to teachers in the absence of more school inputs make a difference? So if the teachers have put in more effort, but they don't have more books and they don't have more materials, can it make a difference? How is that kind of program likely to affect children and their parents? How are school directors involved? So it's important as we think about a program, even if it's targeted at just one group, say a program to provide computers or iPads for students in Tanzania, how is that likely to affect what teachers do, what children do, what school directors do? Now, of course, this is a very simple model, and you all know that there are a lot of other players in education. So for example, students have peers. There are non-state players, so non-government organizations that are actively involved in education. There are bureaucrats, so people at the Ministry of Education who work on the technical side trying to implement these programs. And of course, there are politicians. And a lot of policies and things that happen in education come because some politician makes a pronouncement about how things should be. And it's important, again, while we have these direct factors, which I've put in color, these other factors also play in. It's important to think of the interplay because each of these factors interacts with another one. And so children and parents respond to teachers. If teachers are absent from school all the time, then students are much more likely to be absent from school. If students come to school and they haven't eaten, they haven't prepared, then it's more challenging for teachers to teach them. If teachers don't have any sort of accountability around whether they show up at school or whether they actually teach when they're at school, then it's very difficult for school directors to actually implement programs. Or if teachers aren't getting paid, then it's difficult for school directors to actually maintain discipline in the teaching core. So all of these factors affect one another. And when we report on these sorts of topics, it's important to think, how will this policy affect all of the other actors in this game? So the third point I want to make is, what kinds of interventions and policies do people seek to use to improve education? So a recent study by the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation highlighted 5 different ways that policies can affect education. So they can affect education directly through children, through households, through the education system, through schools, and through teachers. And so when we look at a new policy or a new program, a new intervention, then we think, okay, well, what's the principal way in which this is going to improve either access or quality? So for example, providing information. There have been a few programs, including one in Madagascar, where providing information about the returns to schooling, telling children and their families how much more money they can expect in terms of their earnings or their wages if they get an extra year of school, has had big impacts on students staying in school and doing better. So that's a child-based intervention. Cash transfers is an intervention that largely works through the household. So in Tanzania, I worked directly with a program that provided cash transfers to households, to very poor households, conditional on those households keeping their kids in school and keeping them attending school about 3/4 of the time. Programs could also work through systems like public-private partnerships. In some countries where the government just doesn't have the capacity or the financing to run all of the primary schools, what they'll do is they'll provide some financing as well as supervision to privately run not-for-profit schools in a public-private partnership. Programs that work through schools might include new schools, new infrastructure, giving materials, lengthening the school day. And there are programs that work directly through teachers. And so these include training teachers both before they get hired and once they're on the job, hiring teachers in a way that makes sure you pick the very best candidates to teach the children and the leaders of the next generation, and teacher incentives and accountability. So making sure that good teachers are rewarded for the work they do, and teachers that don't do so well have some accountability, both the opportunity to get better, and if they continue not to improve, they make space for other higher quality teachers for our children. So once again, for each of these is intended to either improve access, so enrollment in school, or attendance, or learning, or some combination. So like we talked about with school feeding, cash transfers, for example, that work through the households, those tend to be very good at getting children to go to school. Now, cash transfers by themselves don't really affect learning, because a cash transfer to the household, that doesn't do anything necessarily for the teacher. It just makes more students come to school, so the teacher has more students. So if we want learning, we might focus on other things. For example, providing teachers with some sort of incentives, or making sure the teachers have the training they need. So with each new policy or program in education, we want to think about which actors it works on and which of these outcomes it's most likely to affect: enrollment, attendance, learning, or maybe all three in a few special cases. So the point here is to remember what's principally being affected and what mechanism is it working through. And once again, remember, how will it affect other actors? So let's pause here for just a moment, and I'll turn the mic back over to Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. That was, you covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. Let me remind our viewers that this whole program is meant for you, and we're set up to take your questions. So please do, I see some of you, there are some of you out there watching. So please do contact us. Just look for the Q&A button on your screen. Click on it, and you should be able to send us some questions. Dave, I'll try to get it started here. Maybe prime the pump a little bit, and I may be stepping on some things you'll be discussing later. But let me try anyway. As you were talking about access, you actually started out giving some data on enrollment rates, and pointing out that enrollment, while it has improved in Africa, it still is quite an issue. Is it too simplistic of me to ask? Can we really identify the reasons why enrollment does lag, and what kind of interventions are likely to be most effective? Is it cultural? Is it attitudinal? Is the problem, are there economic barriers to enrollment? Is it both because families are too poor, or because there are school fees are too big a problem? Can you help focus us on the causes and how we might effectively change that rate, bring that rate up?
That's a great question. It is a multifaceted issue, like you highlight. So there are two ways that people have tried to understand why children across Africa aren't going to school amongst those who aren't making it there yet. So one way is through surveys. So a number of people have done surveys of parents and said, why did your children drop out of school? And in some cases, there have been surveys of children themselves, especially when we get up into secondary school. Oftentimes, it's the students who are making the decision to drop out, not their parents. So in those kinds of surveys, you ask people, a lot of times what they refer to are fees. Now, most countries in sub-Saharan Africa have eliminated all primary school fees, official primary school fees, as well as secondaries. Many countries have eliminated secondary school fees. However, attending school still requires a lot of costs, so what we might think of as unofficial fees. So in a lot of countries, children are still expected to wear a uniform to school. And so parents, if they want to send their child to school, even though they don't have to pay tuition for primary school, still have to find the money to pay for a uniform. In many cases, they have to pay for transportation and get the children, over to the school. Oftentimes, there are other unofficial fees. And so when we do these surveys, that's one way to get at these kinds of issues. And to be honest, the budget constraints tend to come out number one. The other way to get at this, though, besides surveys, is to actually do experiments and examine the data. So for example, with school fees, as many countries have abolished their official school fees, so the cost of schooling has gone down, many people have looked at what happened to primary school and secondary school enrollment. And what we've seen has been really a consistent and often dramatic effect. Whether it's in Uganda or Tanzania or Kenya or Malawi, we see with the abolition of school fees a very sizable jump. Now, of course, the size of that jump depends on where the country was already. And so when Kenya abolished its primary school fees, enrollment was already relatively high, so the jump wasn't as big. But that tells us that these budgetary concerns are a real issue. Now, you highlighted the point of culture as well. And so I would say, for the most part, our evidence suggests that this really is secondary. But that said, there are some factors that come in where we might think about them through a cultural lens. So some colleagues of mine did some work in Burkina Faso, and they gave households, the government of Burkina Faso gave households cash transfers. So the very poorest households, they gave them cash transfers to help them make it through the day. So for some of those households, they said those cash transfers are unconditional. The household doesn't have to do anything to receive it. But in other households, the cash transfers were conditional. They could only receive the cash transfers if they made sure their kids were in school. Now, the interesting thing that came out of that study in Burkina Faso was that in the households where the households didn't have to do anything, then most kids went to school. The boys went to school, the older kids went to school, the kids who were doing better on tests went to school. However, in the households where the cash transfers were unconditional, the girls were less likely to be going to school. So were kids who weren't doing quite as well in tests. Parents were more likely to pull them out of school. So what that tells us is that there are some kids who parents will tend to send to school regardless. Those are probably the kids who they think are most likely to be out in the labor market and working hard. But if we want every child to get a chance to school, in some cases we have to push parents a little bit to make sure that even in difficult times, they keep their daughters in school and they keep their children who maybe don't have, just quite a natural flair for school and are still figuring out what to do.
That's very interesting. I'm wondering if there is data, things that you can show that would persuade people at the family level, parents, that it is in their and their families and their children's economic interest to go to school and stay in school.
So I'll tell you, there's been a recent series of experiments that I think are very promising. So one of them was a few years ago in Madagascar, where researchers went to households and families, and they showed them, okay, this is how much money on average someone who has 5 years of school makes per week. This is how much money someone who has 6 years of school makes per week, and 7 years. So people could really see what's the difference. What happens if I get a little bit more schooling? And they shared that, and they found two things. One is that households, especially poor households, had been dramatically underestimating the value of schooling in terms of improving the quality of life of their children. And after they shared that information, children were much more likely to attend school, and children, unsurprisingly, did significantly better in school. So these kinds of results haven't just been found in Madagascar. People tried a similar experiment with secondary school students in Mexico and found similar results. It's been done in India. It's been done in the Dominican Republic. And again, we find that households, when they just receive a simple informational intervention that tells them about the value of an additional year of school, they tend to keep their kids in school more, and the kids tend to do better.
That's interesting, and that's something I think the journalists would like to, who are watching, would like to get some references on, because I think that certainly if I was reporting on this issue, I would want to take a much closer look. We've got a couple of questions here in the queue. Let me start with one from Dawood. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Who says that in Kano, Nigeria, the problem is that public primary schools in the urban areas are overpopulated, thereby denying access to many students. In the rural areas, access is defined by the distance children can cover to attend schools. In one village, children as young as 6 have to cross a river that doesn't even have a bridge to get to school 5 kilometers away. Worse, Dawood says, is that students may not receive any lessons even after attending classes because of teacher absenteeism. Almost all teachers do not know how to prepare lesson notes and often are underpaid and not paid at all. I think this question really illustrates the point you made, that there are many interconnected and overlapping issues. But I wonder if you can talk about that, the difference in access in urban areas as opposed to rural areas.
Yeah, this is certainly a very important issue, and thank you, Dawood, for bringing this up. We know that I've seen this. I have colleagues who've worked on education in Kano State, and it's a common problem. It's interesting. Sometimes if you talk to an education researcher, they might say, well, class size isn't actually that important. And you might find that that's true if you're working with classes in the United States, where we're talking about shifting classes from 35 students to 25 students or something like that. There's some studies that show some impact, other studies not. It really just depends. But in many African countries, urban Kano is definitely not unique in this regard. You have teachers who are teaching 150 students, 100 plus students. And it's really difficult to imagine the kind of dynamic, interactive teaching that most of us associate with the best quality education happening in that kind of environment. And so there's a real argument in that sort of context for making sure that there are enough teachers and enough schools so that students have access. Obviously in some countries, what they experiment with is double shift schools, where you have a slightly shorter school day, but you have smaller, significantly more manageable groups of students within that school day. One of the things that countries that a lot of the evidence has been suggestive of, even when you have too large class sizes, is there a way that we can help students, help teachers teach to the level of students? So what I mean by this is that when you're teaching 150 students in one class, you've got students there who are the top of the class, who are really ahead of the curriculum and know what they're doing. But you've also got students there who are really struggling, who maybe their parents took them out of school for part of the previous year, but they really needed some remedial education. So there have been a number of interventions recently that help to teach to the level of the child. And so, for example, mixing up classes so that one teacher can focus on those students who need remedial education, and another teacher can cater to those needs of those kids who've really had the best preparation or who are currently performing at the best level, so that they don't feel like they have to slow down. So there are solutions to some of these challenges, but as Daoud highlights, they're multifaceted, and each context really requires a careful look and innovation and experimentation in applying the lessons from other places.
Can you talk a little bit about the overall level of funding for education in Africa? I'm under the impression that it has increased considerably, and Africa maybe doesn't compare poorly to other regions, other parts of the world. But the population is growing so rapidly in Africa that the spending per student does not compare well. If I have my facts right, and that's maybe the first question I should ask you to make sure I am right. But if that is true, is there a way around this dilemma?
So I think what you say is exactly right. Many African countries have dramatically expanded their budget outlays on education in the last decades. And so you have some countries where a very significant proportion of the budget is spent on education. However, if you look at the spending per pupil in Africa, on average across the continent, it's very low relative to other regions of the world. And part of that is because, on average, African countries have much younger populations. You have far more students for this, 15% of GDP or however much of GDP. And so there's a real challenge. Now, what we see in terms of financing is that when we're looking at low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, we definitely see a relationship between the spending per pupil and educational outcomes. Once you get past a certain level, that relationship disappears. And so if you compare the spending, for example, that Brazil or Mexico spends versus US and the Singapore, you won't see any association with the amount of spending and the outcomes. But when we're looking at low levels of spending, a little bit of extra resources per child can make a difference. That said, most African countries right now, or at least many, are going through an economic challenging time with the drop in commodity prices and the like. And so dramatically expanding educational budgets just isn't realistic in the immediate future in a lot of places. So that's where we have to think about spending better rather than just thinking about spending more, and improving the quality of the current spending rather than maybe focusing purely on flashy investments that don't have as much of a return as we'd hope.
Oh, very interesting. I think you're going to be talking about that more in the second half. So maybe I should let that one rest. But there is another pending question I'd like to relay to you. You talked about the kind of two issues being access and quality. And so far we've talked more about access, I think, than quality. But one of our participants, Layla, asks you if you can share any success stories on the issue of quality improvement. What programs have worked and what made them successful?
That's a great question. So what I'd love to do, maybe, perhaps this would be a good moment to actually transition into the second piece. That's exactly the next thing that I want to talk about, is what we've learned about what works to improve learning. The short answer, Layla, is that yes, there are success stories, but it's still a real struggle. Many countries are struggling with learning. I haven't put these up, but some of the best data on learning around Africa are from the World Bank's service delivery indicators, and those are easily findable online. And those really document across a whole range of African countries the high levels of teacher absenteeism from school. And then a challenge that a lot of people don't realize is that even when teachers show up at school, there's a high level of absenteeism from class. And so maybe they're hanging out in the teacher's room or the like. And then these same indicators, they show that we have really disappointing learning outcomes in a lot of countries. And when you test the quality of knowledge of the teachers, you actually find the same thing, that you have real gaps in the knowledge the teachers have of the content they're supposed to be teaching. So it's a real issue, and I'll highlight in this next piece a few of the solutions that have been the most promising.
Well, thanks to Layla for setting us up for part 2 of this program. Dave, why don't you go ahead and go back to the slides, and we'll talk about the issue of quality more.
All right. Thank you, Chris. So the question that comes out of Layla's is, do we know anything about what actually works? So recently, a colleague of mine, Anna Popova, and I did a study on this, what really works to improve learning in developing countries. So for this, we don't just draw on evidence from Africa, but we draw on evidence from low and middle-income countries from around the world. Because while it's important to draw lessons from within Africa, obviously lessons of things that have worked really well in Bolivia or Thailand can be relevant depending on the context as we think about how to improve outcomes across Africa. So one of the things to underline here is that in the last 25 years, there has been a massive expansion in evidence on what works to improve learning. So for example, if you look at this figure, these are studies that we were able to find showing what works to actually improve student test scores in reading or math in low or middle income countries. And what you can see is that back in the 80s, there were very few of these studies. So there were a lot of articles that people wrote about education, but studies that actually looked at, does this policy or this program improve student learning? There were very few of those. For example, even if you just go back to the year 2000, as of the year 2000, up to that point, we could only find about 30 total studies. Now, if you fast forward to the year 2014, you find about 30 studies that came out just in that year. So it's a dramatic transformation, and we see this information is continually being created. Up until we found about 227 total studies as of the end of 2014, and I see them coming out constantly. Studies that show for programs in Ghana and Senegal and Tanzania and Botswana and Burundi, what's working to improve the quality of learning. And also, just as important, what are people trying that isn't working? So over the last couple of years, at least 6 reviews have come out on this same topic. So different scholars have looked at this array of evidence, and they've tried to figure out, okay, looking across all 227 of these studies, what's really working to improve learning? What's making the difference? So we went through all of these reviews, and we found what they had in common. Here's what we found. First, interventions that match teaching to student learning levels. Before I talked about this in response to Dawood's question, how we have, you have classes with 150 students, and a teacher is supposed to simultaneously teach to the students who are currently the highest performing and the lowest performing. So a variety of interventions that have helped teachers to focus at the individual level that a student is at this point have really made a difference in student learning. So for example, a program in Liberia that helped teachers with what's called formative assessment. So basically training teachers in how to assess their current student reading levels. And so they know they don't have to wait for some official exam at the end of the year. Over the course of the year, they've got training in how to do quizzes and tests. These are low stakes, but it helps them to assess student performance. And then this same program provided some materials to help teachers respond to where students are at in their place. And that made a significant difference in Liberian students' learning outcomes. So in Kenya, a program out in Busia province in Western Kenya tried tracking. So they assigned students to separate classes based on their initial ability. So instead of having two fourth grade classes where you have the brightest students and the less prepared students in the same class, they gave students an initial test and then separated them and put those students who did the best on the test in one class and those who did the worst on the test in another class, so the teachers could focus instruction at the level of learning of individual students. Now, this kind of program isn't without controversy because, of course, these students who are in the lower performing class, those students have lost access to their higher performing peers. So you might think that they would do worse. The fact of the matter, however, is that in this case, both classes ended up doing better and learning more as a result of the fact that teachers could focus the instruction at the level of learning of individual students. So everybody won. Now, of course, we don't want any student to permanently be on a lower performing track or a higher performing track. Every student should have the opportunity to excel. However, for short periods of time, putting students into individual ability-based groups can really help them learn. A program like that in India worked very well, so taking on a lesson from another part of the world. So their schools there were reluctant to reorganize classes based on the individual level of learning. So here's what they did. They expanded the school day by 1 hour, just 1 hour, and for that hour, students regrouped based on their level of reading proficiency. So for most of the day, they were just in their regular fourth grade class, but then for this extra hour, they split up, and the students who were doing very poorly in reading, it didn't matter what grade they were, went to one class, and those who were doing well went to another class, and all students ended up doing much better as a result of just this additional hour. So a similar program has been implemented in Ghana, where teaching assistants have helped pull out students and teach at the individual level of those students who aren't performing quite as well. So there is evidence that helping teachers to match teaching to the individual student level learning levels can really make a difference. So sometimes the way interventions do that and programs do that is through computer-assisted learning. So for example, programs can use math software to help students learn at their own pace. In a program in India from a few years ago let students work on math software, and if the student was having a little more trouble, they could go slower. So there's a brand new study that just came out a week or two ago that actually showed even more striking evidence on this, also from India. So in this case, new math software adapted dynamically to student learning levels. So if a student did well on a few questions, the questions would get a little bit harder. If the students didn't do well, the questions got a little bit easier and helped students learn how to do what they didn't know how to do so well. So this program had really dramatic, significant impacts on student learning, and it's a very promising way for the future. A program in China that provided laptops that included learning software and games that were linked to the curriculum had a really sizable impact on student learning. Now that said, it's easy to get excited about computers in learning and to keep thinking that computers are going to completely change how we think about learning. So an inventor from about 100 years ago, Thomas Edison, who famously invented the light bulb, around this time, around 1916, he predicted that 10 years from then, textbooks would be completely eliminated, and we wouldn't need, and many people around that time predicted that we wouldn't need teachers because we can use motion pictures and later computers. Obviously, that isn't the case. More recent programs that have just tried to give out laptops or desktop computers have largely been unsuccessful. So programs in Peru and Uruguay that just distributed laptops to children but didn't really focus on integrating with the curriculum didn't have any impact on helping children to read better or do math better. and in some cases not even helping them to learn essential computer skills. Likewise, a program in Colombia that put computers into classrooms but didn't really integrate them with the curriculum or train teachers in how to use them in classroom instruction, largely sat unused in the course of instruction. So computers and other technology are no sort of silver bullet, but when they're used in the service of helping teaching to reach the level of the individual student, they can make a big difference. So a second finding that has been effective in a number of countries is individualized repeated teacher training. So a lot of teacher training is not very effective. A lot of teacher training across Africa is extremely theoretical, and it doesn't give teachers lots of practical tools to actually improve learning in the classroom. But there are some exceptions. So there was a program in Kenya and Uganda that trained teachers and provided them with regular mentoring to implement early grade reading instruction. So really helping kids in grades 1 and 2 to learn how to read in their own local language in these two countries. This program had positive impacts, and the biggest impacts were in Uganda, but it had positive impacts in both countries. So training these teachers and then giving them regular mentoring. So they received some initial training, but then they got regular feedback. How am I doing? How can I improve? Likewise, a program in India that provided local contract teachers. So these are teachers who aren't part of the civil servant force. They're hired, usually local community teachers. They gave them just 2 weeks of initial training. So who would think that would be enough to actually improve learning outcomes? But with that training and then reinforcement throughout the year, these local contract teachers worked with the students who most needed remedial education and really made a big difference. So a lot of these trainings are often associated with a specific method or task. So for example, a program that was focused on student reading groups. So this pedagogical method of organizing students into groups with in-school supervisors that provided ongoing guidance to these group leaders made a big difference in student reading levels in Chile. Likewise, a program that helped teachers to learn to use storybooks and flashcards in India made a difference. They tried to implement the same program without a detailed teacher training program and didn't have any impact. So I'll mention one more program that isn't listed here from Uganda that was just evaluated. The results just came out earlier this year. So in this program, what they found was, again, training teachers carefully and then giving them feedback in the classroom, going back to the classroom and saying, well, how are they doing? And providing that training really made a positive difference. But here's an important caveat. That program was implemented by teacher training experts, people who really knew what they were doing. The same program tried to implement the program having government workers carry out the teacher training with the same materials, and the program was incredibly ineffective. It really had no positive impact on student learning. So with teacher training, it can be effective, but like with computers, it's no silver bullet, and really it matters how it's done. We have to make sure we do the right kind of teacher training. But these programs have been effective in Kenya, in Uganda, in Ghana, in Liberia, and in other countries. So those are a couple of things, interventions that help teachers to reach the level of the student, and repeated effective teacher training. Those have both been effective in a number of places. Now, there are other kinds of interventions that have been effective. So coming back to this point about what works. Well, a deworming program in Kenya that provided school students with deworming medication led to more school participation, and then they followed the students 20 years later, and the students had better jobs. I already mentioned this program in Madagascar that provided information on the returns to education that improved both attendance and learning. A brand new study showed that in India, building rural roads, which is very relevant. I've traveled on many rural roads in Sierra Leone and Tanzania, and improving those rural roads can actually make a huge difference. In India, improving the quality of rural roads and building rural roads improved both attendance and learning of primary school students. And so in each context, there will be different things that will be most effective. But it makes sense to start when we think about how to intervene with some things that may have been effective in some other context, and think about how can we adapt it to improve access and improve learning in our local context. So remember, when we report on a proposed policy or program, we can look, is there evidence from other countries that can inform the experience in your country? So if the government of Liberia were rolling out a program where they're distributing iPads to students in a lot of schools, can we look at the experience that students in Tanzania or Kenya, or incidentally, there was an evaluation of a small pilot in Kano State, Nigeria, giving iPads to students or Kindles to students to help them to learn. And can we draw on those and maybe report some findings from those experiences to lead to more fuller reporting as we think about the evidence? Okay, so that's the substance. And I just want to share a few tips, again, from the perspective of someone who researches in education and works in education, that might lead to even better reporting than the good things that I'm seeing. So one, we've talked about before, remember to use the dual lens of access and quality. How will a program affect children's access to education, and how will it affect how effectively they learn? A second is to think, again, recapping, beyond the direct players, who's affected? So if the program directly affects children, how does that affect teachers indirectly? Or if it directly affects school directors, what implications does that have for teachers and students and parents? So as I looked through coverage of education across African newspapers, one of the things that I saw was a lot of coverage of speeches and conferences. And so, for example, you can see this from just a few days ago. The vice president talked about how teaching methods in Nigeria are obsolete, and that's why learning outcomes aren't as strong as we want. A former president of Ghana giving a speech about how Ghana's education system really needs regular review to improve its quality. So in some ways, it's tempting to always report on speeches because they're right there. The government officials share the transcripts. They have these high-level events and they invite journalists. And it's important to do that. It's important to see what leaders in a country are saying about education and what they're proposing to do about education. So it's very important to include this kind of coverage. But at the same time, we should make sure that we balance our reporting with what else to report on. So new education policies, new programs from government or non-government organizations, and new studies of programs in your country. So like I mentioned before, there's a constant stream of these impact evaluations that are coming out, whether they're done by the World Bank or the Poverty Action Lab, or academics or researchers there within your own country. And giving coverage to that can provide really valuable balance to the coverage of the speeches and conferences, which are also important to hit. Another tip is to complement reporting with real data. So when we report on whether it's a speech or an intervention, we can draw on real data about education in these countries. And there are a lot of these data available. So for example, the World Bank has World Development Indicators. When I was preparing this presentation, the numbers that I pulled up on access and the private school situation all came directly from the World Development Indicators. Those are freely available to anyone, and they can be downloaded in a matter of minutes. There's a similar set of indicators from many African countries from the demographic and health surveys. For neither of these do you need to be an expert in education or in education statistics to bring a few simple statistics about the context of education in your country. Now, there are also local surveys in different countries. So there's an Uwezo survey in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda that specifically measures early grade reading for students. There are household surveys. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, there are these service delivery indicators surveys that have been done in many African countries and capture a whole range of educational outcomes. And so whatever we're reporting on, adding a little bit of contextual data to say, well, where are we right now in terms of access? And where are we in terms of learning? And how can we complement what we know about a new program with where we're starting from? So a related tip to that, I'll just say a couple other resources on that I've put here. There are annual reports like the Global Education Monitoring Report that have a lot of data For example, I put this figure here about how across a number of countries, how many primary school students have personal copies of textbooks. These are data you might not easily access, but this report comes out every year and has a lot of good evidence on African education. The Education Commission just came out with a report that's more of a one-time that provided the statistic below that across sub-Saharan Africa, just 0.3% of education budgets, not of the whole budget, just the education budget, is spent on pre-primary education. Chris mentioned early on that I'm working on the World Development Report on Education from the World Bank, which won't come out till next year. And then there are constant regional studies coming out from the World Bank and other organizations. So one that I drew on earlier in this presentation is on mathematics education in sub-Saharan Africa that I've looked through for a lot of really good background data on mathematics performance and attitudes across the continent. So a complement to that point about making sure that we report with data is to complement reporting with evidence of impact. So for example, in Tanzania, the government is in the midst of scaling up a major cash transfer initiative with conditions on whether children stay in school. Well, when reporting on that, one could highlight that there was a pilot of that initiative there in Tanzania that actually tested what impact it had on children's schooling. And as you can see, the program led to, for example, a 15 percentage point increase in the children who have completed primary school by age 15 to 18. So we actually have evidence in that case that could complement the reporting on this new program beyond our speculation of what impacts it might have. So where do you find this kind of evidence? So one is to check reviews of evidence. So we've compiled, for example, a database of education studies that highlights, that brings together a lot of these reviews of all the evidence. So often when I'm looking at a new topic, I'll open up these reviews and just search for the country that I'm working on. You can also just search for impact evaluations together with the kind of program you're reporting on, whether it's class size reductions or contract teachers or computer-assisted learning. The last tip is to remember that education is about people and not just programs. Education is about learners, and researchers like me are best suited to look at the numbers. But journalists have a unique opportunity to make data and statistics come alive with the stories of students and teachers and their families. Very few people are moved to action by statistics. They are moved by stories. So getting these stories and reporting them is a valuable service that essentially only journalists provide. Now, it's important to choose stories that demonstrate the truth about programs. And so, for example, if we have an evaluation of a program that shows that 90% of students failed to benefit, it doesn't make sense to dedicate the whole of an article for the stories of those few students who did benefit. We want to make sure the stories we tell are actually backed up by the broad truth of what's going on in the program. But together, the stories and the statistics can both motivate evidence-based policy making and spur people to action. The same thing is true when we report on studies. So if you find some new report or some new study on education, we can ask, who are the researchers? Why do they ask this question? Am I getting their results right? The vast majority of researchers have websites with their contact information, and frankly, every education researcher I know is desperate for their evidence to make it into the media to get their results out to the public. They want to talk with you. And so with reaching out, often it's not too hard to track them down. I often get reached out to by journalists from around the world when they're reporting on issues, and I'm always excited to share the evidence that I'm producing and my colleagues are producing to improve the quality of education in Africa. So just to wrap up, no country escapes poverty without quality education. It's just fundamental. And good reporting can hold policymakers accountable, and it can keep citizens motivated and informed. And so alongside with all these tips and all these ideas, I just want to thank you all for your service in this great effort. Thanks. Back to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Again, a very, very interesting and very useful presentation. I want to remind everybody who's watching that we are open to your questions. We're eager for them, as eager as researchers are to get their stories out in the media. We want your questions now. But the time is limited, so don't hesitate. Please send them in. Let me also mention that these slides will all be available online. So, if you didn't get to copy down one of the web links, that information will all be available to you. I wanted to ask you, you started this second half of our discussion by talking about how there's been this great increase in the number of research studies being done. Can you give us a report card on the uptake? Are people really taking to heart the lessons of these studies?
So I think that what we're observing is that, well, there's certainly a lag. And so I think there was a period where researchers really kind of believed that it was enough for them to do the study, and then that somehow, it would magically get into the hands of some, the technical advisor to the Minister of Education, and it would become policy. Now, obviously, that's a naive view, and more researchers are inclined to work closely with policymakers to get their evidence into the hands of policymakers. So I would say the uptake still isn't what one would hope, but I know of example after example of organizations that are working on this. And so my World Bank colleagues work with governments to design programs to improve the quality of education, they make sure that governments are aware of this evidence. I know other organizations like the Poverty Action Lab, based at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, works on education in many African countries, and they work closely with governments to make sure that the studies that they're preparing are actually in the hands of the decisions that these governments are making. So there's positive movement in this area, but there's still definitely room to improve.
One thing you didn't talk about is governance. And I'm wondering if there's anything that we should be talking about in connection with, to what extent should education be decentralized as opposed to focused in national government ministries of education, and to what extent should there be efforts to increase community enrollment and community participation and parent involvement?
So that's a great question, Chris. A lot of countries have made the move across Africa to do increasing decentralization of the power in schools. So part of that is decentralizing budgets and sending more resources to the local schools. And some of that is decentralizing decision-making power. So giving schools more decision-making power in hiring teachers or reallocating teachers or how they organize the school. And some of those programs have involved active community involvement in spending these grants for schools and this kind of thing. The evidence on this is mixed. So on the one hand, if you don't have if the central government doesn't have strong capacity, of course it makes sense to send some of these resources down to the school level. Now, in terms of whether this actually has a positive impact on student learning and student access, what we've seen is there's a very recent review on this, which suggests that basically in communities where you have high capacity to help monitor and strengthen schools, decentralizing more power to the communities really makes a positive difference. So if you have high literacy rates in the community and you have communities who have the space to get actively involved, then it can make a really big difference. That said, in extremely low literacy communities, we haven't seen this same level of success. When more and more power is decentralized to the community, that community doesn't necessarily have the tools right at their fingertips to help monitor and improve the quality of schooling. At a very local level, I analyzed this with some colleagues working together with the Ministry of Education in the Gambia. And we saw exactly this. In high literacy communities, getting the community more involved had a real positive effect on student learning. But in the low literacy communities, while it didn't really do harm, we didn't see those positive effects. And so ultimately we have to take a nuanced view for how we think about decentralization. And if we're going to decentralize, we need to make sure that we give communities with lower levels of literacy the support they need to be able to engage constructively.
And how about parental involvement? What difference does parental involvement make or could make in educational outcomes?
So there are a couple of different ways that we might think of parents being involved. So one way is parents being more actively involved in their own child's learning, making sure their child gets to school on time, making sure the child has study time, this kind of work. So what we've seen, for example, from these studies I mentioned where we share information with parents and students about the returns to education, having supportive parents who are making sure kids are getting to school makes a big difference. The same is true with these cash transfer programs. Parents can really make sure their kids get to school. Now, there's another way we might think of parents being involved, which is where the parents are really supposed to provide some sort of accountability to the teachers. So we say, okay, we're going to use the parents to monitor whether teachers are absent or present. We're going to use the parents to judge the quality of, whether or not the teachers are really teaching effectively. Those programs, we have less evidence on that, but from what we have, the results are a bit more mixed, and that's unsurprising. We wouldn't expect in either a rich country or a poor country for, parents aren't observing exactly what's happening in the classroom. So they have much less opportunity to influence the specific decision-making process. And most parents aren't trained teachers. And so they wouldn't necessarily have expertise in how the teacher should be doing pedagogy. And so interventions that help parents to get their children to school and to get them there prepared and supported, I think we have very good evidence that this is a positive direction to move. Getting parents involved specifically in the classroom and the pedagogy and keeping the teachers accountable at that level, it's a little bit less obvious.
Okay. Just a quick question about absenteeism. It's come up a couple of times now. What's the explanation for the high rates of teacher absenteeism?
It's a great question, and we see, the numbers are always really staggering when you look at them. There's a lot of variation across countries. So some countries do better, in some countries the teachers do a little bit worse. So there are a number of reasons. Some of this relates to conditions. So some evidence from 7 countries around the world that came out a few years ago looked at some correlates, what was associated with higher teacher absenteeism. In a lot of rural schools, you have teachers who are based very far away from their families or based from where their home counties are. And in those contexts, you have much higher rates of absenteeism. What's probably happening in that case is people are maybe leaving early to spend the weekend with their families and coming back late. And so you have challenges with distance. But another real challenge just has to do with accountability. If you have an education system where teachers don't face any consequences if they don't show up to school, then over time it's easy for there to develop a culture where being present at school and doing your job isn't highly valued. And so if teachers are absent 30% of the time and they don't experience any consequences, then over time teachers and their peers are going to start believing that, well, maybe it just doesn't actually matter that much. Maybe that's not an important part of my job. Maybe it's more important that I run an errand for the head teacher or that I help with the political polling in this community. And so this is where strengthening education systems so that teachers are accountable. This doesn't have to be a draconian thing where, we're firing everybody who missed 3 days of school. It's just a matter of making sure that teachers know that people care whether they show up at school. And if you pass a threshold of absenteeism, there will be some sort of consequences so that they know that this is a professional job and you carrying out your responsibilities is taken seriously.
Okay, I know that's an issue that seems to come up a lot with the journalists I know. Let me relay to you a question from our friend Dawood in Nigeria, and it's one that actually goes to the centralization, decentralization issue to some extent, and also points out just how messy these issues become when you're on the ground dealing with them. A year ago, the Kano state government set up 2 teams, Dawood says, at both the state and local government levels. The goal was to address issues of low enrollment and poor education quality. The state was expected to mobilize funds and channel them into school projects in the local areas, and to ensure accountability by looking at building more classrooms and providing instructional materials. At the local level, the teams were expected to monitor pupils and teacher attendance as well as the quality of lessons. Seems pretty logical. But according to Wood, it appears that there has not been much improvement to come out of this. And he attributes that in corruption in management of funds and poor political will to really apply accountability measures. So here's a real life situation. Do you have any suggestions about what could be done to make efforts like this more successful?
Right. Well, thanks for coming back on this, Dawood. And obviously, it's an incredibly frustrating situation. I don't know that, obviously, I don't know that particular intervention, or the results on it beyond this short account. But I will say that there is a real challenge when we create in many countries. This isn't unique to Nigeria. Many countries, we create new committees and we create new systems. But we don't necessarily have the incentives or the accountability for them to really do their job and to really carry out that work. And so, there was an intervention in Uganda about a decade ago that was incredibly effective, where what they did was they saw exactly what Dawood, what you highlighted. They saw that a lot of the money that was supposed to be getting down to the school level in this case was kind of disappearing, and so they were having an issue with funds disappearing. And so they started a new program where they just started printing in the newspapers how much money each school was supposed to be receiving. And by making that information public, they experienced a dramatic reduction in the leakage of those funds. In this case, because communities started holding their schools accountable. When school directors and district education officials would say, oh, there's no money to make this sort of improvement, then parents could say, look, we know how much money is supposed to be attributed to this school, and so why isn't it getting there? And so obviously that's one intervention, and it never makes sense to take the exact same thing and just implement it blindly. But this principle of creating a system of accountability where, the ultimate consumers, the people that the government and the civil servants are working for, is students and their families. We create a system where those students and families can actually help hold these civil servants accountable and help them get the job done.
In that connection, has there been much use of performance-based budgeting in education programs?
So there has been some. It hasn't been done, to my knowledge, at any sort of large scale in Africa. Other countries have absolutely done this and have built, student test scores and students improving their test scores into teacher raises and teacher bonuses and teacher contracts. Now, we don't have the time to get into all the technical issues of it here, but I will say, holding teachers accountable for test scores can be one piece of the puzzle, but there are a lot of complications around that. It depends on, the level the students are at when they arrive in your class, and there's a lot of noise in these measurements of student tests. So it doesn't make sense to make that the only thing that we hold teachers accountable on by any means. Now, there is one recent pilot in Tanzania, which had some interesting findings. What they did was, they they had teacher incentives based on student test scores. So if teachers were able to deliver significant increases in student tests, they would get a bonus. This was in Tanzania. And then in some of the schools where that bonus was offered, they gave the school a grant to improve the quality of the school. And in others, they just offered the teacher incentives. And what they found was that these programs worked best together. So just giving incentives for teachers without giving them any resources to improve the quality of their teaching wasn't enough to completely make a difference. Putting those two, or not to make as much of a difference as doing those two things together.
There are many, many issues we could discuss. We are getting close to the end of our time, though, and I guess maybe I should ask you if there's anything really important that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you, or that none of our participants have asked you.
Well, I would just say, just to add to the answer to that earlier question that you asked. So, we have good evidence that quality education, so education that produces student learning, leads to economic growth at this macro level. And we have evidence from African country across African country that at the individual level, education has returns. So students go to school and they earn higher incomes and they're more likely to come out of poverty. So it really just makes a difference. Even the schooling that we have right now, the relatively low quality schooling in some contexts, still may offer some benefits to students. But that said, many countries are really lagging in terms of learning. And I feel like we can't overstate this enough. And it's very important to capture the fact that we really need programs and policies and interventions that are going to help schools fulfill their promise to students and give them not just a seat to sit in, but actually some knowledge that they can use as they move forward in their lives.
Okay, let me actually ask you one last question of my own that does go to the whole issue of pedagogy. It seems, my impression is that many African school systems have a model for education that would be considered pretty out of date in much of the rest of the world. Very much oriented to discipline, to rote learning, rather than instead of teaching kids how to learn and how to ask good questions, school systems are expecting them to absorb lots of information and repeat it. Is that understandable because that's more appropriate to the needs of African economies and the African workplace? Or is there really a need for more innovative and student-centered kinds of teaching, even in Africa?
I think it's absolutely the latter, unambiguously. So, the characterization that you gave, I think, is certainly true in a number of contexts. I'm heartened by the fact that there are some places where innovation is really happening. And so, the Gambia in their secondary school science program, I just attended a presentation last week where they're really innovating in promoting student-centered learning. Now, that's a small pilot in a small country. There's a long way to go in this regard. But, Africa is increasingly engaged in the global economy. And the global forces are continuing to apply, and Africans need the exact same skills and the same quality of skills as people everywhere in the world. And so the same kind of active pedagogy is essential. Now, it's important to remember that there's more than one factor at play for why we don't always have the style of teaching that we think is the most effective. So sometimes that's because the teachers just don't have the right training. That's absolutely true. Sometimes it's because teachers don't have the right incentives. And so, active teaching in a lot of ways requires more preparation and more effort than just standing up and saying something and having the students repeat it or copying something off the board. Sometimes inputs play a role. So if the classroom has exactly one textbook, which only the teacher can use to teach all of the students, and the students don't have access to materials on their own, then it's more difficult to say to the students, okay, now go work on this project and discover some things for yourselves. It's still possible, but it's more challenging. And so there are a lot of factors that contribute to that, and we need to work on solving all of these problems if we want the kind of quality, student-centered, active learning that we know is effective.
Very good. I actually wanted to relay more an editorial comment than a question from the questioner who has been so active in this webinar. He pointed out that there is a perception in some places that at least in rural areas, people are not interested in education and they don't care about education. But in fact, in his experience, that's not at all true, and they are very, very interested in education. And I think that might be a lesson for us all, that and especially for journalists. And going back to the point you made at the very beginning, that there are all of these different participants, parents, and their interests and their aspirations are a part of the story. And journalists are well positioned to make sure that those those aspirations are reflected in discussions about education. Might break a few stereotypes.
It is absolutely true, and I'll just say to confirm what you're both saying, we have survey data from the Gambia, from Ethiopia, from other countries where you ask parents about their aspirations for their children's schooling. And what's striking is that even the most uneducated parents have extremely high desires. So parents who have 1 or 2 years of schooling, they want their children to graduate from university. They want their children to graduate from secondary school. And in the end, oftentimes it just seems that life gets in the way. And so I think it's on us, all of us, journalists, policymakers, to make sure that the services are provided so that families can, in fact, give the education that they want to their children.
Well, that's a very, very good and eloquent conclusion. I wish we didn't have to conclude, but we have run out of time. Let me just thank you, Dave Evans, for your very interesting and energetic and exciting presentation. And let me remind participants that this is part of a series of webinars, and we are going to share with you a website here, I hope, that will enable you to look back at all of the other webinars that we've conducted as part of that series. If we have the slide.
We do indeed.
Okay. So there's where you can get all of the information about all of these webinars. I'm biased, of course, but I think there's some very useful information in them. So please visit the site and keep up the good work. So on that note, I thank you, Dave, and thank you to those who participated.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to everyone who's online.